The Great Reset, the global elites plan to overhaul the economy, take over society by extension. We talk about this a lot on Stopping Socialism TV, and I'm kind of wondering if our listeners, our constant listeners, hear this stuff and just throw up their hands. What are we going to do? How can we possibly push back against these people that have so much power and so much influence? So we're going to talk about how we can fight back against the Great Reset on this segment of Stopping Socialism TV. But before we do, I have to put out that call for all of you to help us get this message out there, because if it were just left up to YouTube, Google, Facebook, nobody would hear these, nobody would watch these videos, no one would hear this message. So we need you to help break through that algorithm, like this video, subscribe to our channel, share this video, do what you can to help push this message out there. It's the best thing that you could do to help us, really. And it's pretty easy, honestly. It's a click of a button. But anyways, let's talk about it. The Great Reset. Justin, do we need to do an elevator pitch of what the Great Reset is? Or do you think everyone listening to this kind of knows by now?
I think that if you don't know what the Great Reset is, I think you should take some time to watch the videos that we've done in the past on the Great Reset specifically. I think that it's really important that people understand the Great Reset. They understand the most important parts of it. It is maybe the most important thing going on in the world right now, at least from the American perspective. And so I really do think that people should take the time to really dig into it from a very basic sort of understanding. Essentially, the Great Reset, there's two primary parts to it. It's a large international movement among the elites of society that want to transform the global economy. The first part of the Great Reset, the first big part of it, is a massive new or a whole set of massive new social and welfare programs, things like federal jobs guarantees, the Green New Deal, all of that kind of stuff that you normally see the left promote, but you're actually seeing people who are the heads of corporations and the heads of organizations that may not normally be openly socialist supporting these things. And then the second part of it is this thing called ESG standards, environmental social governance standards, which are very complicated. So you should watch the videos we've done in the past. But the basic idea is they want to reevaluate the way all businesses in society function, the way they're evaluated, so that instead of just looking at profits and the quality of goods and services and traditional economic metrics in order to evaluate businesses, you look at a whole bunch of social justice goals on top of all of those other things. So you might look at how many, what the ratio of Asians to Hispanics are working in the company. You might look at the carbon footprint of a company. You might look at how committed they are to various environmental and social causes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in addition to all that other stuff, in order to come up with a way to evaluate businesses.
I always say that it takes the individual out of like the priority seat when it comes to like the businesses and how they're judging whether or not to give services and products. It takes the individual out of the equation and replaces it with this oligarchy of powerful elites that get to tweak the metrics and judge a business and whether or not it should survive or not. That's the Great Reset, and as we've covered in multiple videos here on Stopping Socialism, it is coming. It is coming. They have gotten a large foothold. They're not backing down. A lot of this stuff is happening as we speak. So just in hearing all of that, and like I kind of pitched at the very beginning of this, when you hear that, you might just throw up your hands and say, well, what could we possibly do? We've done actually a video in the past of how our work is actually kind of moving the needle a little bit, but what can we do? What could our viewers do to help kind of combat this Great Reset plot?
Right. Well, I think the first thing is that everybody needs to, I think the first thing is we need to figure out a way to communicate what the Great Reset is to other people in our lives so that they're aware of what's going on. But we need to do it in a way that doesn't sound like you're a conspiracy theorist, right? Like that's the first, it can't sound like you're talking about, I don't know, like something that you might see on Alex Jones' show, for example, or fake moon landings, or, it's got to sound flat earth. You can't go the flat earther route. Like you got to sound In fact, I wouldn't even use the words Great Reset. I would actually describe the parts of the Great Reset without calling it that, because even though that's the name that they chose, it sounds crazy. Just even talking about it, you kind of sound like a crazy person just saying the words the Great Reset. So I would argue that if you're communicating the message to someone who isn't, already the kind of person who would be concerned about this sort of thing, in which case you could just go full bore right into it. I would argue that you should try to focus on the parts of it that are going to be most concerning to regular people. So maybe someone in your life who doesn't want big corporations controlling most of society. They don't want big corporations making decisions for all of us. They don't want big corporations deciding what racial quotas should be like in businesses, and who should get loans and who shouldn't get loans, and what kind of car you drive and what kind of job you're allowed to have, and all of these kinds of things. And that's what they're doing. I mean, that's what these ESG standards are all about. It's about controlling and social engineering society to fit the goals of the people who are in the ruling class. And right now that's left-wing goals, but that could easily become right-wing goals. That could easily become totalitarian goals. It could be anything, really. And so if you're concerned about the elites in society, not just here in America, this is a global movement. In fact, many of the leaders of this are in Europe and in Asia. They're not even in America. If you're concerned about the global elites controlling how our societies operate and function, then, you're going to be concerned about the ESG standards and the parts of the Great Reset that are about manipulating and controlling society. So I would focus on those kinds of things, but it is important to educate people that this is going on and to show them the proof of it, and to use the words and the statements and the articles that have been written by the supporters of the Great Reset themselves, so that you can show people what the movement is all about, without, people having to believe you and your interpretation of things, because they're very open about how radical this whole plan is. That's one of their big selling points, is that they're going to completely transform all of society. That's what the Great Reset means, pushing the reset button on all of society. So show them what this is in their own words. Try to take the flowery language out of it so that people don't get bogged down in the social justice language. Show them what it's all about. Show them how this is all focused on controlling society from the top down. And I think you're going to win a lot of people over. But so that's the first step. You gotta show people what this is all about. Otherwise, they're not going to hear about it anywhere else. I mean, most people in the media, other than people like us, people like Glenn Beck, occasionally Tucker Carlson and some others, no one is talking about this. And if they do talk about it, it's in a positive way. So you've got to figure out a way to reach people in your own life. It needs to become a grassroots movement.
Yeah, and I would say another thing is, and maybe this is one of your points, and sorry if I'm stepping on your toes for this one, but we've done a video in the past about the personalized ESG score, right? So we had did a whole video on this, so go back and check it out if you're interested. But we have a colleague that logged into his like a 401k account, and lo and behold, he had his own personalized ESG score based on the investments that his money was put into. They gave him a score, and it was like a 4.7 out of 10. It wasn't a good score. He's obviously a degenerate in the eyes of in the World Economic Forum, right? But, this isn't some abstraction of just how the global elites are trying to manage companies and how companies and corporations globally are being judged. This is like a very individualized look. Like, you have a score. If you have a 401k account with one of these banks, you have a score. They're judging you. And, using the terms like Justin said, avoiding like the conspiracy sounding terms. But this concept is rooted in stories that are talked about in the news, whether it's China's social credit score, for example, right? And you could see how this personalized ESG score could resonate with someone being like their own individualized social credit score. And if you can't see kind of the bad road that leads to, then you might not be convinced by anything. So that's another probably a good angle, is to really focus in on the individual ramifications of this plan.
Yeah, exactly. I think another really important thing that people need to keep in mind in regards to how we beat back the Great Reset is it needs to become a grassroots movement. Okay. I alluded to that before. Education is part of that. Talking to people is part of that. Obviously, we've been working with Glenn Beck for a long time on the Great Reset. He's been doing a lot of fantastic things, videos. Donnie and I are working with Glenn on a book that's about this. So we're doing all kinds of educational things, trying to get people educated about it. But it needs to at some point become a grassroots movement, very similar to what we saw with Common Core and with other reactions to these big top-down things, with Common Core and with Agenda 21 to some degree, but Common Core was the most recent example of this. That wasn't just conservative people. That was all sorts of people. That was Democrats, that was Republicans, people all across the political spectrum that didn't want education decisions, especially these really terrible education decisions, being made from the top down. Common Core was all about national education standards, and the federal government, as they do with just about everything, were completely screwing up education standards and then imposing them on local governments, or really coercing them into adopting them is the better way of thinking of it. And there was this huge grassroots movement against it. And eventually it became so widespread, it became so toxic, this idea of Common Core, that the idea kind of died out. I mean, they tried to repackage it, and they tried to put it into place in other ways, but it really, the movement died to a large extent, and it died because of the grassroots reaction to it. And so there needs to be a grassroots reaction, a widespread grassroots reaction, not just from the right, but from people on the left who don't want elites controlling society too, where people push back and say, no, we don't want corporations, big, gigantic, billionaire corporations making decisions for us. We don't want banks and financial institutions deciding who gets a loan and who doesn't based on politics and a whole host of ideological issues. We don't want international institutions telling America how we're going to operate and how we're going to run. I mean, I think those are all things that people on the right and the left can agree on to a large extent. And so there needs to be a bipartisan reaction, a grassroots reaction to this that puts pressure on corporations, on banks, on institutions, international institutions, and governments here in the United States to reject these concepts and these ideas because unless we have that pushback, they're going to keep going forward with it, and they're going to try to get away with as much of it as they possibly can. So exposing it, educating people, and then building a grassroots movement, which hasn't really happened yet, that needs to happen in order to put pressure on these institutions to go in the other direction.
When I first heard you kind of compare this grassroots idea of kind of taking on the Great Reset to this Common Core thing, like the anti-Common Core movement that happened, that totally that resonated with me so much, because when it comes to the policy that we cover here, or at the Heartland Institute, even education was kind of on the lower end of my list, right? I could hold my own in conversations about healthcare policy, climate, environment, all of that type of stuff, budget and tax, for example. Education policy, though, was a little bit outside my wheelhouse. But I knew, just based on some things, some articles, some speeches that I've listened to, that Common Core was bad, right? I didn't need to know all the ins and outs of why that policy was terrible to know that I didn't like it. So yeah, I think if we were to have that same type of mobilization against the Great Reset, that would be so. I think that would be so helpful in trying to take down this thing, and I think that honestly that might be the biggest tool that we have to fighting against this Goliath.
Right. So let's imagine for a minute that we had this big grassroots movement. We had a lot of pressure put on politicians to do something about it. The pressure might be enough to get a lot of corporations to stop going along with it. At least in the short term, or to, and maybe, I don't think they're ever going to totally abandon it, but at least in the short term to not go along with it. But how do we get what can politicians actually do? I mean, what do we want politicians to actually do in order to stop this? Well, I think there are a couple of things. And again, this will make a lot more sense if you go back and you watch the videos we've done on the Great Reset, so you understand in depth kind of what the pieces are to this. But the first thing is, there can be regulatory changes made. This is not going to happen with Joe Biden because Joe Biden supports the Great Reset. John Kerry has openly said he's the climate czar currently, the special climate envoy or whatever they call him to the Biden administration. He's a cabinet member. He openly has supported the Great Reset. He has said previously that Joe Biden supports the Great Reset. So Joe Biden is not going to do anything about this. Plus, it's nap time for Joe Biden all the time. So he's not doing much of anything these days. But I think if we get another president in office who does not support the Great Reset, one of the things they can do from a regulatory standpoint is put regulations in place that make it impossible for financial institutions to make decisions, lending decisions and financial decisions and other things based on anything other than the financial side to it. In other words, banks have every right to make good financial decisions. They have every right to do that. But big, gigantic banks and financial institutions should not be saying, you know what? We're not going to do business with Republicans anymore. We don't want to. Now, right now, there's nothing stopping them from doing that. If Bank of America tomorrow says, you know what, we're done doing business with Republicans. It's all over. We don't want you guys. We don't like you guys. And unless you guys become Democrats, we're not doing business with you. Essentially, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot. Now, they're not going to do it that way. But if they're crafty about it, they can get around any existing regulations that exist. And they can basically make that policy. So what we need to do, and we've already seen this with social media companies and with others doing similar things, what we need to do is have rules and regulations in place that make it so that financial institutions can't discriminate against people based on their ideological beliefs or what kinds of business practices they're engaged in. So if you're an oil and gas company and you're following all the laws and you are providing goods and services that people want and you're not doing anything illegal, then as long as you're going to be able to pay the loan back, as long as you are in every other respect a good lendee, you should be able to get loans. You should be able to get bank accounts. You should be able to do business with banks. Banks should be open to everybody in society so long as they are, able to repay the loans and, it's not a financial train wreck for the bank. They should have to provide you with goods and services. They shouldn't be allowed to discriminate against you because of your ideological beliefs or the kind of business that you're engaged in, unless it's an illegal business. In other words, they should treat you the same way they are not allowed to say, you know what, we don't serve blacks here. We don't serve Hispanics here or whatever. Banks can't do that. It's illegal. But it's not illegal for them to do the same exact thing based on your ideology. And so we need to have protections in place that open up the marketplace to everybody so that banks aren't discriminating, because that's one of the primary ways this Great Reset thing is going to happen. It's through the banking and financial institutions deciding to only do business with some people and not with other people. And they, of course, have investments in all of these other industries that they're only allowing, for example, like with the fossil fuel industries. There are a lot of banks and financial institutions that have investments in renewable energy sources. And then they're openly saying, if you don't go green, we're not going to do business with you. Well, they have a conflict of interest there. I mean, that they shouldn't be allowed to do that. They shouldn't be allowed to invest in solar companies and things like that, while simultaneously another wing of the business is refusing to do business with an oil and gas company that's not breaking any laws and has plenty of money to repay loans. And right now, that's the kind of thing that's going on. There's a lot of corruption and cronyism and all kinds of things going on in the banking and financial institutions in industry. And that needs to be weeded out through regulations. And that's something that can happen pretty much overnight. I mean, a regulatory agency can do that overnight. And I think it's possible that you might be able to do some of this at the state level. So you could have state regulations, I think, that say, if you want to bank in Texas, then you can't discriminate against natural gas companies. You can't discriminate against people who do fracking. You can't discriminate against, bakeries that refuse to, adopt electric vehicles only. You can't make these discriminatory decisions in Texas. If you want to do it in California, then fine, we can't control that. But in Texas, we say you can't do this. I don't know why states couldn't do that. They probably could do some of that. And that gets a little messy because there's state laws and there's interstate commerce and there's all kinds of other things you got to weigh. But there's some of that they can do. And some states are already starting to do that with social media companies. There might be an ability to do that with other kinds of businesses as well. So I think that there's an ability maybe to put pressure on state governments. And many state governments are run by Republicans. Most state governments are actually run by Republicans. So there might be an ability to do it at the state level. So that's an actual tangible regulatory policy change that lawmakers can actually put into place that would put a big damper on this, at least in the United States.
Yeah, and the last thing that I'll say about this is just on an individual level, just for everyone that's watching this or listening to this, is just like prioritize your concentration on some of these things that are in the news. Like Justin said, this is probably the most important thing that is going on just internationally, period. And it's so easy for us to kind of get consumed with like the outrage du jour. You know, what's the story of the day that we're all getting riled up against? You know, is, oh my gosh, another Dr. Seuss book is getting canceled. I better make a post about this on Twitter. You know, it's just like we get too easily caught up in these things that are a little frivolous compared to what we're talking about with this Great Reset. So it's like, I'm not saying that you shouldn't pay any attention to that stuff, and there is an entertainment value to just how ridiculous sometimes the things that come out of the left. But like, you have to have the priorities. You know, this is the most important thing that is going on. And we need your attention, we need your focus, and we need your support. So again, I'm just going to say this one more time, like, to get this message out there, we need you to like this video. We need you to share this video, subscribe to our YouTube page, Stopping Socialism TV. You can find all of our content on stoppingsocialism.com, across various social medias, Facebook, Stopping Socialism. We have an Instagram account. We have a Parler account. So you can find our stuff pretty much everywhere as long as you look hard enough. Justin, where can the fine people find you?
They can find me at Justin T. Haskins and on Facebook and Twitter and Parler and at heartland.org. And of course, anywhere that I publish articles. So at The Hill, Newsweek, and Fox News are the three main ones these days.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in. We will talk to you next time.